Welcome to today's talk. Today we're going to be talking about Coburg Lake and the white ibis. My name is Alex English. I'm the open space planner at Moreland City Council. Yeah, just if this is all working okay. Hope that's coming up for you. I don't know if you missed that first bit, but we're talking about the white ibis at Coburg Lake. And first, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I think it's a very suitable topic given the waterways are such significant cultural heritage to the Wurundjeri that we need to respect and care for it. And today's a bit of a conversation around how we'll do that. So I'm hoping that I could share a screen, and it looks like the option that I had there has just disappeared. So I'll have to just talk you through it, and hopefully we'll get some interesting discussions here. So I suppose before I start with the talk about the white ibis, I think it's important that we understand the sort of the changes that have happened in the urban environment. And we've sort of often talk about the city as quite a hostile place for most of our native flora and fauna. But it's interesting, if we walk down into the CBD, we'll find peregrine falcons nesting in skyscrapers. We'll find the movement of our parks, the ground hovering with activity of brush-tailed possums in our parks. If we look up in the sky at dusk, we'll find the endangered grey-headed flying fox, almost a mass of them heading across our skies in the urban city. If you walk down streets like Flemington Road in Parkville or North Melbourne, at the sort of dusk as well, you have the deafening calls of the Queensland sort of brush box full of rainbow lorikeets. And then if you head down to St Kilda Jetty, you'll discover a whole colony of little penguins, and they've been out all day and they come back in the evenings and they've been feeding in the bay. So what about the story of the white ibis, and how different is that? So the white ibis at Coburg Lake. Probably first I'd like to say that Coburg Lake is a little park that's situated on the Merri Creek in Coburg on Wurundjeri land, and it's one of Moreland's premier parks. The park's beginnings are actually connected to the prison, and you can probably see that with some of the scary but also impressive amounts of bluestone that have been all quarried and included in the park, including the weir wall. The reserve, the lake, and all its associated vegetation have quite a bit of historical significance, a lot of it dating back to about the 1850s. In fact, Coburg Lake used to be a popular swimming hole, which, before white ibis were there, the humans were in there swimming around. It's got vast grass areas, shaded seating, and there's 3 playgrounds that you can find in the park as well. Very popular for recreation, picnics, and events and festivals. And in the middle of it is the Coburg Lake, which is created by this weir wall. And in the middle of that lake is a little island. And we're going to be talking about many of the inhabitants of that little island. But the Coburg Lake is actually home to over 80 different other bird species beyond just the white ibis. It's a shame, I wanted to show you some of the visuals, but we'll have to skip through to that for next time. Or I can share them online. So before we talk about our Coburg Lake bin chickens or white ibis, what are they? Well, often if we look up in the sky, especially if we're sort of in northern Coburg or Fawkner along waterways, we'll see this beautiful V-shaped formation of birds, very graceful gliders, and the V shape is quite distinctive for the white ibis. They're generally around 70 centimetres high and they weigh about 1.5 to 2.5 kilos, which relatively is pretty heavy for most birds. Their plumage is completely white, with a little bit of black and white in their tails. The distinctive element of the white ibis is that they're completely featherless on their head, and they have this long curved bill. And then they have this beautiful plume of feathers at the base of their neck. Males are slightly larger and they have longer bills compared to females. The juveniles, they have black feathers around their neck. So where do we find the white ibis? Well, they're generally found across the whole of the east and north of Australia. Historically, they were mainly located in regional areas, and they would predominantly be found in sort of floodplains, wetlands, and along the water's edge of rivers. However, since the sort of 1950s, with urbanisation and abundance of food, as well as reliable water with irrigated sporting ovals, and at the same time, the decline of water with a lot more sort of regulated water supplies in regional areas, their habitat has actually declined in rural and regional areas. And yet they have actually spread more broadly. So we're now finding them in WA and they're even appearing in Tasmania, but their populations in urban centres has grown. And so on the one hand, their traditional areas of distribution have declined, urban areas have increased. So what do they eat? And why are there so many white ibis? Well, generally, most people think they probably just eat rubbish, and that's why they're called the bin chickens. But actually, they predominantly eat land and water-based insects, worms, frogs, shellfish like mussels, crustaceans, crayfish, but yes, they also do eat rubbish. The best time to find them actually outside of Coburg Lake is after heavy rain. Probably not so much we've had today, but if we have another downpour, you can head up to some of the big parklands, and those parklands are a bit like their traditional sort of uh, areas of habitat where they would go across the floodplains and they'd be looking for grubs and things like that that come up to the surface during the heavy rain. They're very social birds, and their colonies can be up to 1,500 birds in one space. Their normally breeding period is August to November. However, what we've found in urban areas is that they can breed at any time in the year, and this makes it pretty tricky trying to understand what's happening. One of the things you can tell when they're breeding is some of the skin and their feathers change colour. So the tail feathers you'll find a little bit more yellow when they're in breeding, or there's a bit of skin under their wings, and that's normally a very light pink and it turns a strong crimson, orange, or red. They can start breeding from the age of about 3 and they live up to 28 years. So pretty long life. Now, each time they have a clutch, they normally have 2 to 3 eggs, sometimes up to 5, and they'll incubate and look after those eggs for about 3 weeks. And then they'll remain on the nest there for about 7 weeks. But one of the really interesting things about white ibis is actually their behavior in breeding season. Generally, what we'll find is the males, they find, well, it's probably not Tinder, but it's a similar platform. It's a vegetative platform. And they'll try and find the highest branch up in that. It might be a tree. So if we go down to Coburg Lake, we can often see these trees. And they'll go up to that top of the tree and they'll be very loud and they'll be very territorial. They'll try and defend it against other males. And then if a female thinks it's a pretty good little perch up there on their little Tinder platform, then they'll wander over and the male, if he sort of thinks, okay, this is working out, you'll find they'll bow and they'll bow down to her. And then they'll grab a branch or a twig and they'll pass over that little twig. And if the female accepts it, then there's an acceptance of that pairing. And then they'll come together and they'll start sort of preening each other, sort of cleaning up and spend a bit of time. After that, they'll actually fly off to a suitable nesting site, a bit like the island in Coburg Lake, where they'll build a nest and they'll raise up to 2 clutches of baby white ibis every year. So, yeah, I think that's pretty special, that little ritual. So, white ibis and humans. So, I suppose why are we talking about this? It's because I think the white ibis have raised a lot of questions about, you know, are they a pest or is this a success story? Is this something we should be celebrating? Well, one thing we know is like some of those other species I talked about, the grey-headed flying foxes and the brush-tailed possums, they're pretty tolerant of humans and they love the food that we provide them. So during the millennial drought, their population grew in urban areas. But then we started to find in a lot of cities, especially around Sydney and the Sunshine Coast and Surfers Paradise, there are a lot of complaints from other users of these parks, mainly humans. They were concerned about the noise, the smell, sometimes the aggressive behaviour where the birds would actually steal people's lunches and meals from them. but also their association with rubbish bins and that they loved getting into the bins and pulling out the best morsels that have been left there. But we're also finding they have an impact on other native bird species and have a destructive impact on the vegetation. It's interesting though, if you go down to Coburg Lake, I think there might be some human replication going on there because if you find in the bushes, there's actually, I reckon, a group of humans that have tried to replicate a bit of a white ibis bird's nest. Maybe some of you might be able to pick that up and see where that is. So are they tip turkeys or bin chickens, or are they cult heroes and are survivors of urban, I suppose, suburbanisation? Well, it was interesting a few years back, the Guardian Australia's Bird of the Year competition, they came runner up on the back of a sort of a social media campaign run by Team Bin Chicken. So, and I think a lot of you have probably been down to or looked at the Google Maps, and I think it's somebody's taken it down, unfortunately, but there was a whole discussion about Bin Chicken Island at Coburg Lake. And I think that's really quite exciting. I love that social interaction connection with it. So, when did they first appear at Coburg Lake on this island? Well, we've got records, courtesy of the Friends of Mary Creek, who found that the recordings of white ibis appearing in about 2009. But it wasn't until 2018 when their population went from several sightings up to first 40 in 2019, and then they jumped up to about 120, and then we had about 270, 280 last year. So a very dramatic rise in population. And I think if you look at Coburg Lake and Little Island there, you can sort of understand why. They're protected on that island from predators like cats, foxes, and brush-tailed possums. Now, why are we developing or responding to the issues? Well, we were concerned about the impact on vegetation and also other bird species. And so we decided we needed to put together a bit of a white ibis management plan for Coburg Lake. Now, first and foremost, we have to realise the white ibis are protected species. They're protected under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act and the Wildlife Act. So anything that we do that would be disruptive, we actually would need a permit for. So for us to do anything to look at trying to sustainably manage their population, we actually have to develop a plan and present that to see if we can get a permit. The real aim of the plan is to try and reduce the environmental and many impacts of the birds, things like defoliation that I mentioned, impact on other bird species, but there's other things like water pollution, disease, odour and litter that we have to look at. So the plan is very sensitive to animal welfare, but also environmental and public safety and awareness. Education is an important part of that. So the first thing my colleague Laurie Arthur, who's our NRM officer at Moreland Council, did was do an extensive literature search. And then we had a look at all the different plans that have been put out. We had a look at some of the government websites. We had a look at some of the Friends and some of the bird observers websites. But then we also spoke to some experts and we learned about their behaviour and what is the best way to try and understand whether this is a pest or if it's a success story. Because of the, I suppose, the significant impact on the vegetation and other birds, we decided that we develop a staged approach. And that's first and foremost about education, and then looking at what are the causes of that population. Is there litter that we should be resolving locally that is drawing them into this space? And how can we manage that litter? The other part of it is removing some of the weed species from the island and the area around it that they're nesting in. And that's things like the boxthorn or some of the palms that are on the island and have self-populated. And then we look at trying to revegetate that area with native species. A key part of any plan is about monitoring and evaluation. Through all of this, we need to continue to monitor, is this working, is this not working? And we ideally would like to just gently scale things up. Now, if the vegetation works are sufficient and we find we get down to a population that isn't actually denuding the island and is allowing some of the other bird species to return, then we can probably just keep monitoring that over time. If it isn't, then we start to look at other disruptive measures, and that might be perhaps putting in a sprinkler system that might then reduce the potential for the birds to then nest on the island and at that time. But it also helps some of the vegetation to get established. because what we're finding is the island is becoming completely denuded. If that doesn't work, then we can go in and we can actually try and physically disrupt the sites by removing nests when they're not in the egg production process. Or if that doesn't work, then we scale it up and go to the next one where we can oil the eggs. And by oiling the eggs, the birds will continue to nest and stay on them, but they will never hatch. And I suppose that's pretty much where we're at the moment. We've started to do some minor vegetation works, but even that we struggle to do because the birds had already started breeding. And this is the challenge in urban environments, is that they seem to be breeding all year round. I'll be able to share a list of reading through this website, I hope, because it'd be really good if you have a look at. There's some great websites, really fun discussions as well on ABC Radio had a program on Off Track a few years back. The Guardians had some really good stories, but there's also some really good management plans and other readings for you too. But before we start going to questions, I'd really like to say a big thank you to Laurie Arthur, my colleague, who's the Natural Resource Management Officer, and Barbara Johnson, who's in the library team at Moreland. But also thank Anne McGregor and Nicholas Talbot from the Friends of Mary Creek and Louisa McMillan from the Mary Creek Management Committee. Now, I'll hopefully be able to open it up to questions and discussions. And if you've got any specific ones, please add them in and we can look at them. So I'm going to go through your questions you've got here already. All right. So are there other favourite waterbird species in the park we should watch out for while we're there? That's a really good question. So we do have the black swans, we've got cormorants, and we've got, as I said, a whole lot of other species. And the best thing to do is to go to the Friends of the Mary Creek website, and they actually have some bird observing days. And you can join those, and they've got some great experts who will be able to help you on the best birds to spot and where to go and the times of the year to see them. And I think it's an exciting part of that whole experience is learning about more of those birds. A little fun anecdote is, okay, so Julia's helped me out. She's put the link in there. Great. Thanks, Julia. I'm catching up a bit slow on this platform. One of the funniest stories in some ways is, I'm not sure if anybody noticed there was a shopping trolley that had been dumped in the lake, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. Now, council officers weren't allowed to get on boats anymore and clean these things up, so we'd have to get a contractor. So that took a bit of time, but by the time they got around to it, the black swans had actually turned the shopping trolley into a nest. And so they'd created, I suppose, what you call ecological engineering and turned the shopping trolley into their nest site. However, in the last 2 years, we've noticed the white ibis have actually pushed them out of that nest. And so they're the sort of impacts we see is where other species like some of the cormorants or the white ibis, their population has started to decline. Another question was how many? Well, it does vary through the year and is because the ibis do move about, but generally we've got between about 200 and 280. Now let's have a look. Yeah, so the question is why they're only being here for the last 5 to 6 years. And given the limited space on the island and desperation to establish nests has pretty much wiped out whatever trees and shrubs are left there. That's right. So I'm wondering if this population might have moved down from further north, perhaps up in maybe Donnybrook or Craigieburn or Wallen, where there might have been a large residential development and they might have had an impact on some of the traditional grounds that they were on and that they've actually moved down the creek as a result of that. And I think that the note by Joe there about at Leverton Swamp, they don't stay all year. But we have found that they do stay at Coburg Lake, and that's probably because of the food supply, not so much in the lake itself. So we found we haven't had too much issues there, but in the area. Now, we don't have large landfills nearby, but we do have some transfer stations. So that's what we've probably got to start to look at. Question about, yep, Natural Resource Management Officer. It's great to have Joe and Julia here. Thank you. Do they have an impact on the white ibis population on the local swans? Yes, they do. And we have noticed that there's about 4 or 5 other birds that we've actually seen decline on. Now, another person, John, said there is one breeding pair currently there, 2 cygnets this year, both did not survive and they were killed by dogs off leash. And so that highlights that we have to look at this in a more, I suppose, a broader approach. It's not just about the white ibis, it's about how we manage the park and it's about how we manage litter, but also I suppose having spaces that are safe, and I think dog on lead and dog off lead areas is probably another important one. And looking at perhaps is there spaces along the parkland where we encourage people already to have dogs and they're managing that in a better way. And then there might need to be an areas that we have to fence off to protect habitat for species along these areas. So Christopher said occasionally see black ibis in the area, but they don't mix and then they soon move on. Yeah, so we've got, they say, 3 species of ibis in Australia, and really the one we have here is the white ibis. So the other species, well, there's only one other species of the same group, and the other's a different genus. But we don't see too much mixing in this area, and predominantly it's the white ibis. Sometimes they're referred to as a sacred ibis, but the sacred ibis is one that's more found in Africa and overseas. So how can we protect the cygnets? Yeah, it is. That's going to be it's a very relevant question to this talk, and I think that's where we have to look at the different types of habitat and probably a more sustainable manage in terms of the white ibis. So if we can remove a lot of the weed species, then hopefully we'll be able to manage that too. And that's a really good point from Deborah. She's saying there's a lot on an island in Jack Roper Reserves in Broadmeadows. So that's just up on the ring road. And I actually think there might have been some works at Jack Roper Reserve, but also the success of the population at Jack Roper Reserve may have come down to Coburg Lake. And the only way we'd be able to find that out is through genetic testing. But looking at the way that they're flying and moving, I've seen movement of them in between those populations. So shouldn't we be also looking at creating more dog-safe island habitat and more spots for birds to stop? That's exactly right. And I think council has adopted a nature plan, and the idea is to start to look at what are the important habitat corridors and connections for different species that we need to be protecting. And we might find that if we create good habitat along the creeks for some indicator species like the white ibis or the swans, we find a lot of the other species do really well in those areas too. And that's something that Moreland's currently working through and hoping that we can go back to the community and say, okay, these are the species that we think, from a scientific perspective, we think are the indicator species that we want to protect, and this is the implications of that. If we're looking along the Merri Creek, which are often a really important habitat corridors for species, it is about creating those little islands of safety, and they might be fenced off areas or they might be like little islands like the physical ones in the Coburg Lake Reserve. Catherine said maybe to the transfer station coming back. Yeah, and that's a really good point where we need to work with Darebin perhaps on how maybe we can reduce the availability of food at those transfer stations so that the population gets down to a more manageable area level. One risk I didn't talk about, and that's sort of, I suppose, the water pollution, water quality issue, but also the risk of avian botulism. And that's when the population gets too high, you can start to have the birds die. And botulism can be spread and it can spread to other bird species. So one of the things the community can really do is keep an eye on what's happening there. And if they do see more than 2 or 3 birds that are dead, they can let us know and we can let DELP and Melbourne Water know immediately so we can manage that. So has increased human traffic in the park during lockdown impacted the bird life? At the moment, it doesn't look like we are seeing that issue. Um, I suppose there's always going to be an impact. It's probably more about creating the best sort of habitat to support birds. And what we're finding is just grass and trees doesn't cut it. You need to have the shrubs and you need to have diversity of species and diversity of habitats. And so it's really important that we start to think of more of that different types of habitat. And there's probably been increased number of people using all of our parks and more dog walkers, higher dog ownership. And so that puts more pressure on council to start working with Merri Creek Management Committee and the Friends to say, okay, how are we going to manage this in a balanced way so that we can still meet the recreational needs of the community, but also protecting this really important habitat and biodiversity values. What would the impact of oiling the eggs and preventing them from hatching have on the parents? So I suppose it's very hard for us to know about stress levels and things like that, but I suppose what has been found at other sites is that the birds continue to sit on the nest, and they just hoping that then that nest, the egg will hatch. And so instead of having one or two clutches or sometimes three a year, they will only have the one, but that egg won't actually hatch. And what's been found is that they will then fly to another nesting spot, to maybe hope that it's going to be more successful. So there's an impact there again, that if we then push the species out from the space in Coburg Lake, where are they going to go? Are they going to move down to the botanical gardens, to the islands there, or another sort of protected space? So it is a good question, and whether it will be effective. And that's why we need to work with our colleagues and the rest of the community to see what is the impact we're having. Because I understand some of the work that happened at Jack Roper Reserve in Broadmeadows might have been the spark that caused them to move down here. And Kat said she started to see them in North and West Broadmeadows, Gladstone Park, until recently hadn't seen them yet. And that's really true. John McKay says most of the ibis disappear early on in the year for 2 or so months. Where do they go? That's a really good question. And I'd love to know that. My feeling is a lot of them are returning out to the outer suburbs or to regional areas where they've actually got that abundance of food. And I don't think it's particularly at 1 month or 2 months, because we've noticed it moves and relates to climate. So if we've had big heavy rains during the warmer season in the summer, then those birds will fly off to those areas for a feast. And when you've got these large colonies, it is essentially a massive banquet. Deborah said she noticed at least one dead bird on the island yesterday. Yeah, it is something that you do um, you do find occasionally. And I suppose the concern is when we see probably 3 or 4 birds that might be dead on the island or more, and then we have to get in it. But death is a natural part of, I suppose, the sort of, their life. Um, so David said, why are the white ibis so much more common? Now I'd have to go back and find that one. I might have missed it. Why are they more common? Well, I think than the other ibis, I think the question was. Well, I think that's because, again, they're really good adapters. That their diet and their habitat is able to respond to urban settings. So whereas a lot of the other species, I think you'll find they just, one, they're more fearful of humans, but also that they're, I suppose, they've been able to diversify their diet. And we find that diet is probably much more important than habitat, is that if there's a food supply, their population will continue to grow. Kate said the white ibis populations are growing at an alarming rate at Edgar's Creek wetlands. The population grows by 5 birds per week. Yeah, that's right. They just seem to be very effective breeders. And that's why we've got to start to look at, because if we don't manage it at these sites, then we're going to be continuing to have this problem. And so I think some of the modest changes of providing the weed reduction and losing the sort of habitat spaces that they're really attracted to. And examples are the palm trees in Coburg Lake Reserve are protected, but the ones on the island aren't. And so we can actually remove those. They've self-seeded. And I think it is about monitoring them and making sure that we, one, don't have other problems, but also ensuring that we can get these populations to a more sort of sustainable level. Why do they all seem to stay on Bin Chicken Island even though it's overcrowded? Do they understand they're safe on an island like that? I think it is generally that they feel safe. The fact that you can't get foxes and cats, or brush-tailed possums onto the island, that means that they are very protected. I think, you know, it's going to be an interesting one where we've noticed during storms, sometimes a tree comes down and maybe there might be a fox or cat that'll discover those sort of links, and that might result in the loss of the population very quickly. But of course, as they've noted, Kate said that they've got other populations there in the wetlands as well. Um, any other questions there or things I missed out? I'll try and make sure that I can get do they want to remove them completely or just control how many live there? Yeah, that's correct. We don't want to actually remove them completely. It's not viable, and it's really around trying to sort of get them to a more sustainable level. And I think that's why we're really interested in the vegetation works in the first instance, and then if we have to move to the next level. But yeah, I'd like to share some of the slides I put together because I think they provide a bit more of the background. We've got a bit more of the demographics, and the work of groups like the Friends of Edwards Lake, as well as the Friends of Merri Creek, has been really critical to really understand what's going on, but also having the community out there as the eyes and ears and giving us the feedback on the population, or if they do see some other concerning problems happening. Now, got any other questions or suggestions? Should there be signs in the park telling people what not to feed the birds? Yeah, so we did. We put some signs up, and I'll probably need to check that the signs are still there. Often now signs don't last forever, but we had originally put signs up. Now it's probably about 9, 10 months ago, explaining that the birds are protected and that we don't want people to be feeding them. So I hope that that helps. And I think again, managing all of the litter in the area. And feel free to add any other questions there, and maybe I can add them into the text. But thanks, and thanks Julia as well, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'll keep answering the questions, but I think most of it. Could we have a session like this about the black swans? I think that's a really good idea. I notice there seems to be competition between ibis and Indian miners. Yes, I suppose that probably comes back to the type of vegetation as well. And I think that's why we need to diversify and get away from just grass and trees. But they're both very aggressive urban adapters. So that's a good point. But thanks everybody for joining in today. And thanks for all the great questions. And I'll go through the questions there just in case I've missed any, and I'll answer some as well. Okay, so I'll check Edgar if I've missed one of yours. But thanks everybody. Yeah, I think Edgar's one was just about removing the population, which we're not aiming to do. Of the 3 species we've got, they're all native here. And they've all spread in their distribution, probably for similar reasons in terms of the ibis. But yeah, thanks very much, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.